Blake Miller thought the ocean would drown out her courage. He spotted Nia Amara the moment she stepped onto the sand, her white sundress catching the coastal wind, her loose curls damp at the edges, her bare feet pressing slow, deliberate prints into the shore like a woman finally learning to breathe again. She had her back to him. She always did now. And that alone made something dark twist behind his eyes. He had driven 4 hours to get here. Not because he loved her. Men like Blake Miller didn't love, they owned, and somewhere between her packing her last bag and walking out of his apartment without a single look back, she had stolen something from him. Not her presence. Not even her warmth. She had stolen his sense of control. And that, to Blake, was unforgivable. He crossed the beach with the kind of stride that clears a room, broad shoulders cutting through the salt air, jaw set, fists already tightening at his sides. The sky above the water had begun to bruise, deep purple bleeding into gray, the first fat drops of rain spitting against the sand. Nia. She stiffened. She knew that voice the way the body knows a scar, not by sight, but by the low, involuntary ache it triggers. She turned slowly. He was already close. Too close. His black hoodie was darkening at the shoulders from the rain, his boots leaving deep, aggressive impressions in the wet sand. His face was the face she had spent months trying to forget, the sharp jaw, the cold eyes, the expression that had never once asked permission for anything. You think you can just walk away from me? Asterisk. The words came out low. Controlled. The kind of control that was always the first warning before the storm. Nia didn't answer. She had learned, slowly, painfully, that answering only fed it. So she stood still, her posture deliberately straight, even as her hands trembled at her sides. She had rehearsed this moment in her mind 100 times. She had told herself she was ready. She was not ready. Blake's hand shot out and locked around her wrist like a vice, the same grip she still felt in her sleep, and he yanked her toward him, his voice dropping to something that wasn't quite human. We are going home. Now. Asterisk. The rain came down harder. And then, nothing moved. Not Blake. Not Nia. Not the two figures who had materialized from the gray periphery of the beach with the silent, choreographed precision of men who had done this kind of work many times before. Blake felt it before he understood it. A presence. Not loud. Not chaotic. Something far worse, absolute, the kind of stillness that belongs to a man who has never once needed to raise his voice to make another man afraid. Kang Tae-joon stood 15 feet away. His black suit was immaculate. Impossibly so, as though the rain itself had decided not to touch him. He wasn't looking at Nia. He was looking at Blake, with dark, calculating eyes that didn't blink, didn't waver, didn't carry a single trace of surprise. He had been watching this beach long before Blake arrived. He knew exactly what kind of man Blake Miller was, had known for longer than Blake would ever be comfortable with. What Blake didn't know, couldn't know, was that the moment he grabbed Nia's wrist, he had crossed a line that existed in a world entirely above his understanding. A world where debts weren't just financial. Where violence had a ledger. Where men like Blake Miller didn't get to walk back to their cars. Blake's grip on Nia's wrist loosened, not by choice, but because his body had sent him a signal his pride hadn't caught up to yet. Run, asterisk. He didn't run. And that was the last decision Blake Miller would ever make freely. Nia had chosen this beach specifically because no one who knew her would think to look here. It was 2 hours from the city, tucked past a coastal town that barely had a gas station, the kind of place that existed quietly outside of maps and memory. The sand was pale and wide, the water a deep, shifting gray-green that matched the overcast sky above it. There were no vendors, no music, no crowd. Just the wind, the waves, and the particular silence that comes when the world finally stops demanding something from you. She had arrived at dawn with a single bag and no plan beyond breathe. She'd been doing that a lot lately, making decisions based purely on what her body needed rather than what made logical sense. Sleep when exhausted. Eat when hungry. Cry when the weight got too heavy to carry upright. It wasn't a strategy. It was survival dressed up as a fresh start, and she was committed to believing in it anyway. She stood at the water's edge, sandals dangling from 2 fingers, the cold foam rushing over her feet and pulling back again in a steady, indifferent rhythm. She had been standing there long enough for her shoulders to drop away from her ears. Long enough for the tightness in her chest to loosen, just slightly. Long enough to think, maybe for the first time in 3 years, that she might actually be okay. Then she heard her name. Not shouted. Not frantic. Just spoken, flat and certain, from somewhere behind her, the way a man speaks when he has never once considered that he might not be welcome. She knew before she turned. Her body knew before her mind caught up, the way it always had with him, that low, instinctive alarm that bypassed rational thought and went straight to the base of her spine. Blake. He was crossing the sand toward her with that stride she had memorized against her will, heavy, deliberate, unbothered by the soft ground slowing him down. He had driven through the night, judging by the state of him. Dark circles under eyes that hadn't softened with exhaustion, only hardened. His black hoodie was wrinkled, his jaw unshaven. He looked like a man who had spent hours inside his own fury, feeding it, arriving here fully stoked. Nia turned back to the ocean. It was the only power she had left in this moment, the refusal to give him her face. "Don't do that," he said, closer now. "Don't you dare do that." She said nothing. Kept her eyes on the horizon. The waves came in. The waves pulled back. 4 months, Nia. You don't answer the phone, you don't respond to a single message, you just disappear, like I'm nothing. Like everything we had was nothing. His voice had that texture she recognized, the one that sounded almost hurt if you didn't know him. If you hadn't learned, slowly and at great cost, that what he called hurt was actually just rage looking for a more effective angle. You owe me an explanation. You owe me that much. She had rehearsed this. She had sat in her new apartment. The one he didn't know about, the one she'd paid for with money from a job she'd taken quietly, carefully, without telling a single person who might accidentally tell him, and she had rehearsed exactly what she would say if this moment came. She said none of it. Because the rehearsals had always assumed she would be somewhere safe when it happened. A public place. A room with a door that locked. Not a beach with no one on it, 2 hours from anywhere, with the tide coming in and nowhere to go. She had not always been afraid of him. That was the part no one ever talked about, the before. The version of Blake who had shown up first, who had been warm and certain and magnetic, who had made her feel like the most important person in any room simply by looking at her the way he did. She had been 26 and freshly burned by a relationship that had ended in indifference, and Blake had been the opposite of indifferent. He had been consuming. She hadn't recognized consumption as a warning sign. Not at first. The first time he raised his voice at her, she had cried and he had held her afterward, devastated by himself, promising it would never happen again with a sincerity she had no reason yet to doubt. The second time, there was still an apology, but it was briefer. More efficient. The third time, there was an explanation instead. A reason why she had provoked it, a careful accounting of her own failures that left her apologizing to him before the night was through. By the time she understood what was happening, she was inside it so completely that the edges were invisible. She had tried to leave twice before this. The first time he had cried, genuinely, it had seemed, and told her she was the only stable thing in his life, and she had felt cruel for going. The second time he had not cried. He had simply looked at her with those flat, certain eyes and told her that she had nowhere to go, that he wouldn't find her, said it so quietly and matter-of-factly that it hadn't even sounded like a threat. It had sounded like information. She had believed him. She had spent 11 more months believing him, until the night she didn't. Until the night something in her had shifted from afraid to simply done, quietly, irrevocably done. And she had packed a single bag while he slept and walked out of the apartment and kept walking. She had been walking ever since. Look at me. His hand came down on her shoulder and turned her before she could decide whether to allow it. and suddenly she was facing him, and the expression on his face was the one she feared most. Not the yelling, not even the violence, but this. The controlled, almost patient fury of a man who had decided the situation was already resolved and was simply waiting for her to catch up. "There you are," he said, like she'd been hiding. "Blake." Her voice came out steadier than she felt. "You need to leave." "No." Simple. Absolute. "What I need is for you to stop this. Stop all of this. You want to be dramatic, fine, but it's been 4 months. Whatever point you were making, I heard it. Now it's done. I'm not making a point." "Then what are you doing?" He spread his arms slightly, gesturing at the empty beach, the overcast sky, the nowhere of it all. "What is this? What is any of this, Nia? You left everything. Your friends, your routines, everything we built, for what? For this? For peace," she said. "I left for peace." Something moved behind his eyes. It was quick, and it was ugly, and she had time to register it before his hand closed around her wrist. The sky opened up. The rain came in hard and sudden, the way coastal storms do, no gradual build, just an immediate, full-volume downpour that soaked through fabric in seconds and turned the sand dark. Neither of them moved. Blake's grip on her wrist tightened with the kind of pressure that wasn't quite painful yet but carried the clear promise of worse. "You're coming with me," he said. The warmth was entirely gone now. This was the distilled version of him, the one underneath all the other performances. "We're going to walk to my car, and we're going to go home, and we are going to fix this. Let go of me. Nia. Let go." He yanked her forward instead, his other hand coming up toward her face, and Nia did the only thing her body knew to do, she went very still. It was a trauma response she hated in herself, that terrible stillness, that shutdown. She had read about it afterward, learned its name, understood that it was her nervous system protecting her rather than betraying her. Understanding it didn't make it feel like less of a defeat. She stood in the rain with his hand around her wrist and his face inches from hers, and she went still, and she waited, the way she had learned to wait, for whatever came next. What came next was nothing she had ever waited for before. Blake felt it first. His hand was still raised when he stopped, not because he decided to stop, but because something interrupted the signal between intention and action. A sound that wasn't quite a sound. A shift in the weight of the air. He turned his head slightly, the way an animal turns toward a scent it can't yet place. 15 feet away, just at the edge of the wet sand where the beach met a low concrete walkway, a man stood watching. He was not hiding. He had not materialized suddenly. He had simply been there, in the gray periphery of the storm, long enough that he had already taken in everything he needed to know about this situation and formed whatever conclusions he was going to form. He stood with the particular stillness of a man who had never once needed movement to assert presence. The suit was black. Immaculate. The rain was coming down in sheets and the suit was simply immaculate, as though the weather had recognized authority and decided not to press the matter. His face was unreadable. Not blank, not cold, but carved into an expression of absolute, focused attention that was in some way more unsettling than any display of anger could have been. His eyes were on Blake. Not moving. Not blinking with any urgency. Just watching, with the deliberate, unhurried patience of a man who already knew how this ended and was simply allowing events to reach their natural conclusion in their own time. Blake's hand lowered. He didn't decide to lower it. His arm made the decision independently, the way the body makes small, shameful concessions to danger before the mind is willing to admit what it's sensing. "Who?" Blake started. The man said nothing. 2 figures stepped out from behind the concrete wall to Blake's left. 2 more had been standing to his right long enough that they had merged into his peripheral vision without triggering recognition. They were still now, symmetrically placed, their hands loose at their sides. They weren't posturing. They weren't performing. They were simply positioned, with the geometric precision of people who had done this many times and understood that the arrangement itself was the message. Blake turned slowly, taking in the full perimeter of what had appeared around him, and the color in his face changed. The man in the suit took one step forward. Just one. He did not need more than one. When he spoke, his voice was low and even, with an accent that sat beneath his English like a current beneath still water, present, but not disruptive. He was not speaking loudly. He didn't need to. The rain and the wind somehow did not interfere with the words at all. Take your hand off her. It wasn't a command delivered with heat. It wasn't a threat performed for effect. It was simply a fact, stated in the tense of a thing that was already decided, offered to Blake as a courtesy. A small window of time in which he could comply and preserve, if not his dignity, at least his ability to walk back to his car. Blake's hand dropped from Nia's wrist. She stepped back. One step, then another, until she was no longer within his reach. She was shaking, whether from cold or shock or the sudden, disorienting absence of a grip that had defined the last several minutes, she couldn't have said. She wrapped her own arms around herself and stood in the rain and watched Blake's face move through a sequence of expressions that she had never seen on him before. Confusion. Then the beginning of anger. Then something that stopped the anger before it fully formed, something her own nervous system recognized before she had a name for it. Fear. Blake Miller, who had never once in the 3 years she had known him appeared afraid of anything, was standing in the rain on an empty beach looking at a man in a black suit and discovering, at last, the particular experience of feeling small. The man in the suit turned his eyes to Nia then, for just a moment. There was no warmth in the look, but there was something. A brief, precise acknowledgement, as though he were noting her condition the way a person notes relevant information, filing it with everything else he had already catalogued. Then he returned his attention to Blake. You should go, he said. I won't say it more than once. Blake opened his mouth. Whatever calculation was happening behind his eyes ran itself through to its conclusion, took in the 4 men, the suit, the quality of stillness that surrounded this particular stranger, and arrived at the only rational outcome. He closed his mouth. He stood there for one more second, pride making its last, futile stand, and then he turned and walked across the sand toward the distant car park, faster than he had walked in, his boots heavy and unsteady on the wet ground. Nia watched him go until she couldn't see him anymore. The rain kept falling. The waves kept coming in and pulling back in their patient, indifferent rhythm. She became aware, gradually, that she was still shaking, and that the man in the suit had not moved, and that she had absolutely no framework for what had just happened or what came next. She turned to look at him. He was already looking at her. You're safe, he said, quietly, as though the words were factual rather than reassuring. Nia didn't answer right away. She had been told she was safe before, by a man who had then spent 3 years proving otherwise. She had learned to treat safety not as a statement but as a thing that revealed itself slowly, in behavior, over time. But she was standing on a beach in the rain with nowhere to go and a stranger who had just stepped between her and the worst version of a moment she had feared for months. And whatever Kang Tae-joon was. Whatever world he occupied, whatever currency his protection ran on, Blake Miller was walking away. For now, that was the only truth that mattered. One of Tae-joon's men produced an umbrella from somewhere, black, like everything else in their orbit, and held it above Nia without a word, without making eye contact, as though the gesture were simply a function rather than a kindness. She almost laughed at the absurdity of it. The precision of it. The way these men moved through the world as though every contingency had already been anticipated and prepared for. She did not laugh. She stood beneath the umbrella and watched the spot where Blake had disappeared, half expecting him to reappear, because that was what Blake did, what he had always done. He disappeared and then came back, and the coming back was always worse than the original offense. But the car park beyond the dunes remained empty. A distant engine turned over. Headlights swept briefly across the gray sky, and then he was gone. Something unknotted in Nia's chest. Not relief, exactly. Something rawer than relief, the complicated, almost painful sensation of a tension that has been held so long its release feels like injury. Her eyes burned. She pressed her lips together and refused the tears, not because she was ashamed of them but because she did not want to cry in front of strangers. In front of this stranger. This particular, inexplicable stranger in his immaculate suit who had just done something she did not yet have the language to process. She turned to face him fully. Tae-joon had not moved from his position. He stood at a respectful distance, and she noticed it was a considered distance, not an accidental one, the kind of space a man maintains when he understands that a woman who has just been grabbed without consent will need room before she needs anything else. That observation unsettled her almost as much as his presence did. It required a level of reading she hadn't expected. "You were already here," she said. It wasn't a question. "Before Blake arrived. You were already on this beach." "Yes." "Why?" He considered the question for a moment, not evasively, but with the particular pause of a man who chooses his words based on what is actually useful rather than what sounds good. "Blake Miller has owed a significant debt to people I represent for 14 months, he said. "He has been difficult to locate. You were not the reason I was here. But what I witnessed when I arrived became the reason I stayed." Nia processed that. Turned it over. It should have alarmed her, it did alarm her, somewhere underneath the exhaustion and the adrenaline, the idea that she had been standing in the middle of something far larger than a confrontation with a volatile ex. That the beach she had chosen for its isolation had been chosen by someone else for entirely different reasons, and that the Venn diagram of those two choices had converged on this particular morning with her standing at the center. "So I was incidental," she said. "You were," he agreed. Then, with the same flat precision, "and then you weren't." He had a car waiting, of course he did, a black SUV parked on the service road that ran behind the beach. He did not invite her into it so much as make the invitation structurally inevitable, walking alongside her as his men dispersed with quiet efficiency, and she found herself moving in the same direction without having consciously decided to, partly because she was soaked and cold and her own car was a 15-minute walk in the wrong direction, and partly because something animal in her understood that proximity to this man was, at least for the immediate moment, safer than the alternative. Inside the SUV it was warm and silent. Someone handed her a towel, dry, folded, again as though it had been anticipated. She pressed it to her face and breathed into the dark of it for a moment. "Where would you like to go?" Tae-joon asked. The question surprised her. She had expected to be told. "I have a room," she said. "A guest house, about 20 minutes from here." He relayed this to the driver without asking her for the address, which meant one of two things. Either he already knew it, or he expected her to provide it. She provided it. The car moved. They rode in silence for several minutes. It was not an uncomfortable silence, it was the silence of a man who did not fill space with noise out of social obligation, but it gave Nia too much room to think, which at this particular moment was not a gift. "You should know," Tae-joon said, not looking at her, his gaze on the rain-blurred window, "that Blake Miller will not approach you again." "You can't know that." "I can." A pause. "He is going to have a number of other concerns occupying his attention in the very near future. You will not be among them." Nia looked at his profile. The clean, severe line of it. The way he said things like that, things with enormous implications, in the same tone another person might use to discuss the weather. "What does that mean for him?" she asked. He turned then, just slightly, and met her eyes. "It means you don't have to think about him anymore." She wanted to push further. She didn't. Some part of her recognized that there were answers available to that question that she was not yet equipped to receive, and that the asking of them would constitute a kind of threshold she wasn't sure she was ready to cross. She looked out her own window instead and watched the wet countryside move past and tried to locate, somewhere inside herself, the feeling of a woman who was free. The guest house was small and warm and smelled like old wood and salt. Tae-joon did not come inside. He stood at the door while she gathered herself in the narrow entryway, and he said that someone would be in contact with her tomorrow, and she said that she hadn't agreed to any of that, and he looked at her for a moment with something that might have been the closest he came to amusement. "No," he said. "You haven't." He left. She stood in the entryway for a long time after his car disappeared down the lane. Then she went inside, changed into dry clothes, sat on the edge of the bed, and stared at the wall while her mind attempted to impose order on the last 3 hours. Someone came the next day. Not Tae-joon. A woman, Korean, somewhere in her 40s, dressed in a charcoal suit with the same quality of impeccable tailoring, carrying a leather portfolio and the air of someone who managed complicated things for complicated people and had long since stopped finding either remarkable. Her name was Ms. Yoon, and she set the portfolio on the small guesthouse table without being invited to sit, though she waited for Nia's nod before doing so. Mr. Kang wanted you to have complete information, Ms. Yoon said, before you made any decisions. What decisions? Whether to accept his protection formally, or to decline it. Nia sat across from her. And if I decline? Then you decline, and you will not hear from us again. Ms. Yoon's tone was neutral, professional, carrying neither pressure nor its absence. But I have been asked to make sure you understand what that means. Blake Miller's debts are significant. The people he owes are not patient, and his attempts to manage those debts have involved, she paused, selecting language carefully, certain decisions that put others in proximity to his liability. You were in a relationship with him for 3 years. That proximity is documented. The implications settled over Nia slowly, the way cold does, first at the surface, then deeper. You're saying I'm already in this, she said. Whether I choose to be or not. Ms. Yoon did not confirm it explicitly. She didn't need to. Nia looked down at the portfolio. It was closed. She hadn't touched it. What does formal protection mean? She asked. What does Tae-joon, what does Mr. Kang expect? Your cooperation, when asked for. Nothing that compromises your physical safety or legal standing. A brief pause. He is not Blake Miller, Ms. Amara. He would like you to know that explicitly. He sent you to tell me he's not like my abusive ex? Despite everything, something dry moved through her voice. That's a low bar. For the first time, something shifted almost imperceptibly at the corner of Ms. Yoon's mouth. He anticipated you might say something like that. He asked me to tell you that he agrees, and that you are welcome to hold him to a higher one. She signed nothing that day. She asked for time and she was given it. 3 days, which she spent walking the beach at hours she varied deliberately, watching to see whether she was being followed, and concluding that she either wasn't, or whoever was doing it was too skilled for her to detect. She was not sure which answer was more unsettling. She thought about Blake. Not with longing. She had burned that bridge in the last therapy session before she left the city, had sat across from her counselor and said out loud, with her whole voice, that she did not love him, had not loved him in a very long time, had confused fear of leaving with a reason to stay. She thought about him the way you think about a storm after it's passed, taking inventory of the damage, assessing what held and what didn't. What she kept returning to was this. She had spent 3 years inside a structure built by someone else. A structure that told her where to be, when to speak, how to interpret her own emotions, what to want. She had dismantled that structure at enormous cost, piece by piece, in the dark, and she had walked out of it and come to this beach to begin the slow work of building something that was only hers. And now there was Kang Tae-joon. Who was not Blake. She believed that. Not naively, but because she had spent 3 years developing a finely calibrated instrument for reading men who meant her harm, and that instrument, when she turned it toward Tae-joon, returned something different. Something complicated and not without danger, but different in its nature. Blake's control had been about diminishment. What she sensed in Tae-joon was something else. A gravity that pulled everything into its orbit, yes, but not because it needed those things to be less in order to feel like more. That distinction mattered. She wasn't sure yet whether it mattered enough. On the 3rd evening she called the number Ms. Yoon had left and said she had questions before she could give any kind of answer, and Ms. Yoon said that was expected, and the following morning Tae-joon came himself. He sat across from her at the small guesthouse table where the portfolio had been placed 3 days before, and he answered her questions. All of them. Without deflection, without the particular kind of careful vagueness she had anticipated from a man in his position. He told her the nature of his organization in terms that were specific enough to be honest without being more than she needed to carry. He told her what Blake's debt had involved, and why her name had entered his files, and what his protection would practically mean for her daily life. He told her there were things he would ask of her and things he would not, and he drew those lines clearly. She listened. She pushed back on 3 specific things. He adjusted 2 of them without visible resistance and held firm on the 3rd with a reasoning she found, after sitting with it, genuinely sound. At the end, she said, "I need you to understand something. Go ahead. I am not exchanging one cage for another. If that's what this is, if at any point that's what this becomes, I will walk away from whatever agreement we've made, consequences or not. I've walked away before. It cost me everything and I'd do it again." He looked at her for a long moment. The rain had returned outside, it seemed to follow this story like a recurring motif, and the window behind him was streaked with it. "I understand," he said. And then, in the same plain, factual tone he used for everything, "would expect nothing less from you." She did not feel saved. She wanted to be clear with herself about that. She had not traded weakness for rescue. What she had done, what she was choosing to do, with open eyes and her own signature on the terms, was make a calculated decision inside an impossible set of options. That was not the same thing as being saved. That was agency, operating in conditions that were not of her choosing but were nonetheless hers to navigate. It looked different from the outside, she knew. From the outside it looked like a woman moving from one powerful man's shadow into another's. She couldn't control that reading. She could only know what was true from the inside. That she had sat across from Kang Tae-joon and negotiated, and he had negotiated back, and she had left that conversation with more of herself intact than she had entered most conversations with Blake. That was not nothing. That was, in fact, everything. The morning she checked out of the guest house, she stood on the beach one final time. The sky had cleared overnight, properly cleared, the kind of blue that looks almost apologetic after days of gray. And the sand was bright and washed and clean. She stood at the water's edge with her shoes on this time, her bag over her shoulder, her face turned toward the horizon. She was not the same woman who had arrived here seeking only peace and asking nothing of the world beyond the right to breathe. She was something more complicated than that now. She was a woman with full knowledge of what she was walking into, who had looked at the terms clearly and decided that the life on the other side of them was worth building. She was a woman who had survived Blake Miller and the 3 years before this morning, and she was still standing, and that counted for something. A car waited on the service road. She knew whose it was. Nia Amara took one long breath of salt air. She let it out slowly. Then she picked up her bag, turned away from the water, and walked toward what came next.